Scarcely a senior politician who hasn't been in the Wirral these last few weeks. The by-election is seen as vital by the two big parties. They've thrown every resource they can at it. But is it all allowed? There are rules which are supposed to control the amount of money the parties spend on elections. But Newsnight has discovered that all three main parties regularly run by-election campaigns which cost way above the official limits set down by law. Michael Crick's been checking the bills.
It's not the party activists who are working hardest in Wirral South, but the postman, delivering the one free mailing every candidate gets, and many more, which the two main parties are quite happy to pay. A letter John Major sent to every household last week, for instance, must have cost around £5,000 in postage alone. And that was the third Tory mailing voters have had so far. I mean, you've been getting a lot of literature and phone calls in this campaign.
Yeah, I'd like, I hope we're not paying for them. I mean, I hope we're, this actually comes out of party funds, I hope.
What do all the postmen think about all this political stuff there?
I don't mind, really. We're getting paid enough for it, so...
You get paid extra?
We are, yeah, at the moment.
Direct mail and other modern techniques like telephone canvassing have joined more traditional by-election expenses such as posters. In this contest, it's Labour and the Tories who've been the big spenders. But Liberal Democrats admit privately that they spend just as lavishly in those by-elections where they're in with a good chance. The former Conservative MP Rob Hayward had the experience of losing an intensely fought by-election 4 years ago.
Thank you very much. Do you think it's true that in most of the big by-elections parties spend more than legally they should?
I couldn't say that for certain, but I think on occasions it's certainly honoured in its breach rather than its observance. But certainly my impression looking at by-election campaigns where I've not been the candidate is that there's been some pretty substantial expenses undertaken. How much of that is identified in what form, it's not for me to judge.
Do you think the parties do go over the limit a lot on their by-election spending? They're trying to buy elections?
I'd be amazed if they weren't.
Since 1989, by-election candidates have legally been allowed to spend about 4 times as much as at general elections. The limit in Wirral South is just over £31,000. By law, that covers any spending in respect of the conduct or management of the election. The big parties get round the limits by saying certain major items don't count. But if they're wrong, it's an imprisonable offence.
So how much can they spend?
The barrister Rory Mates edits Schofield's election law, which is regularly consulted by anybody involved in the business. He believes spending limits are vital.
There are those who think that there should be a free market in elections, that effectively all controls should be removed, and candidates should be able to spend whatever they like trying to get elected. But I think there are also a large body of opinion that thinks it's important to maintain a level playing field, that one shouldn't be able to buy oneself into office. And if you hold that view, then of course the proper control of election expenses is crucial.
Newsnight has spoken to candidates and organisers from all three main parties who've been involved in recent by-elections, and they've explained to us in some detail how they managed to get round the expenses limits and spend 2 or 3 times as much as they should. In some cases, a lot more. One Conservative candidate told me that at the start of his campaign he tried to insist that the party should stick within the limits, whereupon he says his colleagues looked upon him with incredulity. In that case, they told him, "You'll lose." So it was agreed that the Tories in that campaign would exceed the limits. And he lost anyway. Peter Chegwyn belonged to a legendary squad of Liberal agents from the early 80s who were notorious for their by-election tactics. He's well versed in the art of writing campaign expenses and making small limits stretch a long way.
I can think of by-elections where the Conservatives, certainly if they put every item of expenditure down, were way over the limit. I can think of other by-elections where the same applies with Labour, and yes, with the Liberal Democrats as well. I don't think any party could put every single item of expenditure down on their election expenses return and keep within the kind of official limits that are set. The limits are too low for the things that the parties have to do to win marginal seats. And certainly after a by-election, often agents can agonise for many days of how they can fit what they have done within the official limit. It's not easy. They have to be experts at campaigning and sometimes experts at creative accounting as well.
Historically, the centre parties, in their various guises, have often been the worst offenders.
Where's Rosie? Oh, here. We want Rosie.
Greenwich in 1987, for instance, Newsnight's been told the SDP campaign may have cost as much as £80,000. That's more than 4 times what the official limit was. One SDP source admits some Greenwich voters got 40 or 50 pieces of party literature at a time when printing was much more costly. And Lib Dem sources confirm they've grossly overspent in some of their great by-election successes, such as Newbury, by massaging how much literature was printed, for example, and paying some staff in cash. One Lib Dem organiser says he ran 2 accounts, one for the returning officer and another for internal party purposes. But in recent years, Labour has spent as much, if not more, than anyone. Here in Wirral South, they've devoted enormous resources. Most outside estimates put it above 6 figures, more than 3 times the official limit. In Tony Blair's single-minded drive for victory, he's not keen to discuss what it's costing, though.
Sorry, am I getting in now? Mr. Blair, you do seem to be spending an awful amount of money on this by-election.
Please, Mike.
Sorry, are you sure you're not exceeding the expenses limits?
To make comparisons, I took a trip to Oldham, scene of the last big by-election in the northwest, Littleborough and Saddleworth, 18 months ago.
Hello, it's Michael Crick. I rang earlier. I'm from Newsnight. About coming to see the...
By law, the public is entitled to examine a party's election expenses for up to 2 years after the result.
The official spending limit in Littleborough and Saddleworth was £32,300. In the end, officially, the Conservative Party spent £26,000. The Liberal Democrats spent £28,368, and Labour came in ahead of the field at £30,223. But all 3 parties showed a remarkable ability to make that spending go an awfully long way.
Printing, premises, vehicles, newspaper ads, posters, even the cost of balloons and the helium to fill them, and much more besides, appear in the receipts attached to each return. But people who went to Littleborough and Saddleworth were impressed at the scale of the 3 main campaigns there, which ended with the Liberal Democrats winning. We gave copies of the Littleborough expense returns to a man who has experience of such things.
They're fascinating. I suspect there's a lot of midnight oil being burnt on trying to squeeze what was actually spent into the actual levels here. A lot of creative accountancy. It's interesting comparing the parties. For instance, on professional staff, one party puts down for 1 agent. The others put down no salary. And in fact, everyone knows there were dozens of professional party workers in there on all sides. Mobile phones, not a mention. No one apparently used a single mobile phone through the entire election campaign.
But the big new cost in by-elections is direct mail. The Tory candidate in Wirral South says 3 mailings have gone out to every household already, including John Major's letter, and they've been planning a 4th. When Tony Blair dispatched a letter to Wirral South voters 2 weeks ago, the party was sufficiently wealthy for many of the letters to carry first-class stamps. We took the party's literature of all kinds to a printer in Chester for rough estimates of how much it must have cost, obtaining quotes for 10,000 and 30,000 of each item, starting with Labour.
How much would it cost to print all that?
Well, it depends on quantity. If we went for 10,000, we'd probably be looking at something like £9,500. Obviously, there's bulk quantities. If you go to 30,000...
Say one per voter, one per household?
Yep, we could get down to £17,000.
Now, this is the literature that the Conservative Party have produced. There's not so much of it, but they go in a lot more for direct mail. How much would it cost to print all that lot?
10,000 quantity, probably £7,500. And on the 30,000 quantity, we'd probably be about £12,500.
Then there's telephone canvassing, a cost it's almost impossible to quantify, since party sources say local calls are supplemented by organised phoning from all over the country. Add to that office costs. Labour has committee rooms in each of the 5 wards, plus a large headquarters in this old supermarket, where we counted 21 computer screens. But some of the biggest costs are staff. Both Labour and the Tories say they have a dozen professionals in Wirral South, though in Labour's case it certainly looks like more. The parties clearly don't think, though, that such staff should count as expenses, but others disagree.
If they are full-time party staff, and they've all taken a month's holiday to come and take part in the election as volunteers, then clearly there's no difficulty. But in my view, if they are full-time paid party staff, and they then come to a constituency, let's say for a by-election, in order to support and take part in the campaign to elect their particular candidate, then in my view that comes within the meaning of an election expense within the legislation and should be declared.
Wirral hotels are doing brisk by-election business. One Labour official says their personal bill alone at this establishment will reach £2,000. And since the 16th of January, the Conservatives have had a block booking of 18 rooms at the equally expensive Thornton Hall.
The cheapest room rate here is £73 a night. Do the sums, and it means that at the end of it all, the party should be presented with a bill of more than £56,000. Now, the Conservatives probably managed to negotiate a discount, but then add in other things like meals and telephone calls, and it means that this hotel alone would take up a hefty share, if not all, of the expense limit that the party's allowed to spend on this by-election.
Let this go down first.
Last week, the Tory chairman and his candidate spent several £100s more by unveiling yet another poster on yet another advertising lorry. But Dr Mulwiney seemed rather coy about the financial implications.
Dr Mulwiney, is the cost of that included in your by-election expense?
Michael, it's a very important message.
No, but is the cost of it included in your expenses?
It's a very important message from the centre to all of the people of Wirral South, and indeed, hopefully, through you to the people of the country.
But is the cost of the van included in your expenses, by-election expenses? Because your opponents are accusing you of buying this.
You have an obligation to report the people of England to the interested.
Is that true that you're buying this election with direct mail and telephone canvassing and posters?
Rather than having far
you know better than that, Mike.
You're not buying it.
That morning, the Tory candidate was joined by no fewer than 3 cabinet ministers, a Scotsman, an Englishman and an Irishman, who'd flown up by plane at yet more cost, though the Tories insist ministerial fares, hotels and advertising vans are all really part of national campaigns and so don't count towards by-election expenses. Last week's visitors also included Labour's Jack Straw.
Who pays your rail fare on these occasions?
Who pays my rail fare on these occasions? It's either paid by the party, or if it's a party matter, or if it's related to a constituency matter, because it's also on my line of route to my constituency, then it's paid for by the constituency, but it varies.
But today would be by the party, would it?
Today will be by the party.
Because it must be expensive bringing you and all your shadow ministers up here for these by-elections.
It's fairly expensive, but there we are.
Mr Straw, who hopes to oversee election law as Home Secretary soon, shares the Tory view that the fares of visiting politicians aren't part of expenses, but experts would challenge that.
If a political party is spending money on transporting people to come to a particular constituency...
Ministers, for instance, or shadow ministers?
Indeed. Then that is an expense that is directly connected with the campaign to elect a particular candidate, and in my view is declarable as an electoral expense.
Have you had a lot of leaflets, or has anyone...
We've had an awful lot of leaflets, an awful lot of letters.
We brought Peter Chegwyn up to the Wirral to give his professional estimate of how much the campaigns are really costing. Simply adding up the very minimum forked out on major items such as literature, posters, staff, hotels, phones and postage easily puts the big 2 over the official limits.
I think the 2 main contenders, Labour and Conservative, £100,000 or more, quite possibly an awful lot more.
What about the Liberal Democrats?
They're spending an awful lot less.
Isn't that a sign, perhaps, that they're not taking it quite so seriously?
In this constituency, maybe, yes.
The Lib Dems have used only a handful of professionals in this by-election, compared, for instance, with 30 salaried staff that party sources say they had in their Newbury triumph.
I never fight any election except at full pelt.
So you don't seem to have devoted the same resources here, though, that you did to places like Christchurch and Eastleigh.
It's a matter of dark secrets, how people devote their resources and where and in what ways.
After the Wirral South result is declared in the early hours of Friday morning, the party agents each have 5 weeks in which to draw up their by-election expenses and submit them to the returning officer. And judging by past experience, that could involve feverish, anguished consultations with their professional advisors. At the beginning of April, those expenses will become publicly available, and they should make extremely interesting reading.
But nobody believes any of the major parties would ever complain for fear of rocking the boat. And should anybody else lodge an objection about Wirral South, any police inquiry would simply be overtaken by the general election.
Thank you. All the best.
At that election, some marginal seats will be fought with almost the same intensity as this contest. And then, of course, constituency expenses limits will be a quarter of the size.
Michael Crick reporting. Well, both the Conservative and Labour parties declined to talk about what they're spending in Wirral South, and each insisted they'd submit a full legal account at the proper time. The Liberal Democrats have so far declined to comment. There are a total of 12 candidates standing in the Wirral South by-election, which was caused by the death of the Conservative MP Barry Porter last November. Now, in a moment, we'll be looking at Deng Xiaoping's economic